So I think you and I share one thing in common, that we kind of wish that we'd come of age as Catholics in the 1950s.
That's a big admission for you to start this conversation with.
Of course,
I think I should end it right there. I've won. It's over.
No, I mean, I think as you beautifully lay out in this book, Bad Religion, the quality of Catholic intellectual life, the coherence of its spiritual and communal life, was at a peak, it seemed, just as we were at a peak of middle class strength and cohesion in America as a whole. Now, we know all the forces that have unraveled the American middle class in many ways. Why did Christianity, from such a strength, I mean, one of the things I don't quite see the answer to, I know you're trying to find the answer to it in the book, why did it so wither so quickly in the 70s and to some extent, and it stabilized a little bit now, but why the sudden collapse of this confident, self-confident Christianity?
Well, I mean, I think the reason not to wish that we'd come of age as Catholics in the 50s is that then we would have lived through precisely that collapse. I mean, maybe the only thing worse than coming of age in the aftermath would have been to, if you're a conservative Catholic, to suddenly have the Latin Mass replaced with guitar masses and so on. And just to sort of, I mean, what really struck me, and this is a book about American Christianity in general, but particularly where Catholicism is concerned, just sort of the sense of sort of complete flux and disarray that gripped at least the Western Catholic Church, both in Europe and the United States in the late 60s and 70s. And it was something that was back in the Church's past from before I was born. So to read about it and sort of experience it secondhand was kind of a striking thing. And I think that I have in the book a sort of list of causes, right? Because you have to have a list of causes. And I think the first one is the one that I think everybody talks about, and that's the sexual revolution, right? And I think that the kind of crisis that created for Christianity is pretty easily understood. It was a massive shift in social mores.
The pill, basically.
Basically the pill, but, and sort of the broader cultural consequences that rippled outward from that, but basically the severing of what I think had been a real link between sort of the basic Christian view that, chastity was very important and sex was supposed to be reserved for marriage, and obviously, people had sex outside of marriage before 1964, but just that there was this ideal that people were trying to live up to. That Christian idea, I think, was linked to sort of a kind of simple common sense in the world of, say, 1946 or so, in a way that it wasn't linked to simple common sense in the world of 1976. And that,
But it wasn't really available in 1946. I mean, you couldn't have
sex
without risk of procreation.
You couldn't, right. And that lack of availability meant that
But why should a religion, we're talking here about a belief in God made man 2 millennia ago, spreading a message of divine compassion and love and giving himself up for crucifixion. Why would those beliefs be affected by a change in sexual I mean, it seems such a strange, distant issue.
But think about the Gospels, right? And think about the things that Jesus talks about in the Gospels. Essentially, he lays a great moral stress on two big issues, I'd say. One, and this is where the strongest stress is laid, is on the moral temptations associated with great wealth. And the second, and it's a lesser stress because I think it was probably a lesser issue in a way, but it's still real, is a stress on the importance of sexual chastity. And, the sort of, Jesus has a way of taking this sort of the commandments of the Jewish law in both cases, really, and strengthening them, saying, it has been said to you X, but I say to you Y, and Y is usually harder, right? And, it's not just...
But when Y is also impossible.
Well,
Y is also... You can't even look at a beautiful woman and feel attracted to her without having committed adultery, which is... That's a very high standard.
It is a very high standard, but I'm just saying that's the sort of, those are the moral standards that the Jesus of the New Testament sets, right? He sets, and I agree. He sets just follow me here for a moment.
Yeah.
So what happens in the 60s and 70s, and it isn't just the sexual revolution, right? It's the combination of the sexual revolution with, I think, an unprecedented affluence in the Western world, and particularly in the United States. And the era that we were just talking about, the 40s and 50s, this period of great strength and resilience for the Christian churches, that's an era of a generation that came of age with material privation, with having seen prosperity melt away during the Great Depression, having lived through the Depression and then the rationing and everything else in World War II. And the generation that succeeds them comes of age in a kind of cornucopian abundance. And I think it's out of those two things, and part of what I try and do in the book is weave those two together in a way I think they're often separated. The combination of sort of unprecedented opportunities afforded by affluence and what seemed like unprecedented sexual opportunities afforded by the sexual revolution, the birth control pill, and so on. They make, on the one hand, they make what were already impossible admonitions seem that much harder to live up to, right? It's one thing to say, don't look at a woman, with lust in your heart if, you live in a Mediterranean village and you see 25 women in the course of, a given week.
In a sack.
We're not gonna. No, this is even in a more freewheeling Mediterranean village, right? But it's another thing. But it's another thing to say, those commandments get harder in an age when, magazine covers get more sort of provocative, and then in an age when the internet makes everything provocative. And the same is true with wealth. It's one thing to say, do not covet thy neighbor's, whatever, when thy neighbor doesn't have that much stuff. But in 21st century America, thy neighbor, or maybe not thy neighbor, but the people who you watch on $1 million listing on Bravo or something, the amount of stuff available to covet has become so extraordinary.
I would think your second argument about affluence is much more persuasive than the sex thing, even though for you, I mean, and don't you think that in a way the deepest source of some of your own alienation from, at least from our shared Catholic Church, has to do with sexual issues, right? Yes, primarily I have to say the abuse of children and the cover-up of it was much more problematic for me than my struggle to understand why I was born a homosexual and how I should live my life according to the Church, figuring that through in ways that made psychological and spiritual as well as a natural law sense.
But those are different kinds of crises. I mean, the crisis that the sexual abuse epidemic posed for you, I think, is the kind of crisis. I mean, I have a 14-month-old daughter. I feel it viscerally, and again, to sort of write a book like this and go through so much of the documentation on the sex abuse stuff is, it's absolutely sickening, and you can completely understand the sense, the deep sense of alienation that provokes. But it's a different kind of alienation. I think it's not an alienation from necessarily the New Testament message. It's an alienation from the Catholic Church as an institution in a particular time and place. And as we know, as an institution in a particular time and place, the Catholic Church has had a lot of dark hours over the years. Yeah, so I guess I just think that if you're looking at the overall trajectory, yes, right? I mean, to me, it seems like there was a shock and then an aftershock for Christianity. And the shock was the 60s and 70s. It was mass affluence. It was globalization. It was the sexual revolution. And then over the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen a kind of aftershock, which is the result of sort of a backlash against sort of, the religious right, the sense of a conflation of religion and politics, and then the crisis in the Catholic Church over sex abuse and so on. But I think the first shock is still the more profound one. And the second one is sort of, the religious right came into existence as a kind of response to that first shock,
I
right?
see. Well, that's one reading.
That's one reading, yeah.
You're right that it is interesting that the sexual issues seem to be the ones upon which people fasten and define themselves in a way. is not sex, I mean, you would concede that, as you did, that within the Gospels, Jesus is not that concerned with it. There are 2 or 3 mentions of it. There is the woman caught in adultery. There is the admonition against divorce.
Right, or the strengthening of...
But these are not central themes, and in fact, he tells his disciples to leave their families, as you cite in the book. He tells you to hate your family if you have to choose between it and him. Right. The vast teachings of Jesus impinge upon sex not a little. Isn't there a danger that, in fact, what the sexual teaching and elevating it to such an extent was really about the church's authority's ability to control the lives of their flock in a very guilt-inducing, slightly unhealthy manner, which kept them in power. Once that power was dissolved by the people themselves, then it showed that the church was not resting on the gospel. It was resting upon certain forms of social control and social repression, and giving power to a church authority that could alone absolve you of sins that...
That's a pretty harsh reading of the Catholic past. But, I mean, yeah, there's an element of truth in that story. I think that story varies a lot. I mean, you would tell a very different story, I think, about Irish Catholicism versus Italian Catholicism, let's say, or versus Spanish Catholicism. I mean, one of the great things about the Catholic Church is it is this global institution that has expressed itself in very different ways in very different times and places. And, in certain eras and certain cultures, you do have this very strong stress on the ethic of chastity and so on that can absolutely shade into a kind of, you need to confess X sins every week, and
I'm
so on.
thinking more of Paul. I think Paul and Augustine are much closer to this kind of Christianity than Jesus seems to have been.
Although, in a way, but I think...
For them, the lust, the desires of the flesh seem to be far more important.
But what's striking about the Gospels is that, yes, Jesus does clearly he talks more about the temptations of wealth than he does about the temptations of sex. But every time,
status,
but every
or class,
absolutely,
or of identity.
But when he's given opportunities to talk about sex, to talk about marriage, and so on, he makes 2 arguments, right? And one is a strengthening of the Old Testament law in the cases he's given on questions like divorce and the definition of adultery and so on. And the other, as you rightly point out, is a sort of is the idea that there also might be a higher calling than the institution of marriage and so on, and that you might need to leave your family and so on. And but that calling is not a call to a form of it at least in the New Testament as it comes down to. It's not a call towards sort of leaving those institutions behind in order to express yourself sexually in many more exciting ways, right? It's a call to leaving the family behind in order to pursue a more ascetic way of life. So given that grounding, I think the issue for a lot of Christians who I think would might share your overall perspective, right? That yes, it's important not to make sexuality the heart of the Christian story, would also say, but it's also important not to just sort of set that part of the New Testament aside.
I don't think you
right?
can. I don't think you can. I think it's quite clear in some ways,
Paul,
especially on divorce. But let me think of it.
But it's also, let me just say, it's also that, I mean, people are interested in sex and they're interested in arguing about sexual morality because sex is so fascinating to so many people. And I think one of the reasons, I think that it works on both sides, right? You have conservative Christians who want to emphasize these issues, and then you have liberal Christians, secular critics, and so on who want to say, look, the only thing the Pope ever wants to talk about is sex. And actually, the Pope mentions sex, in one line of one speech, in one talk out of 600 addresses he gives, most of which are about the love of Jesus Christ. So I think it works both ways, that everybody's obsessed with sex. And that especially in our contemporary culture, and that colors our reading of religion.
Yeah, except I'm lucky in as much as, even though I am from an Irish Catholic sort of background, my mother, who was the one who mainly instilled Catholic doctrine and discipline into me, as well as the priests, never would say sex is a sin, but it's really not that big a sin. People are, it's one that good people are particularly liable to fall into, or as Malcolm Muggeridge once put it, he didn't understand why lust was so wrong, since it was always give, 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 as he put it.
And that's a very a very Dantean point of view. If you read, the Divine Comedy, the sins of lust are, they're occupying one of the higher circles of. I mean, there are many sinners who Dante places below the adulterers, the fornicators, and so on. That's absolutely true. But I also think there's some very.
Go ahead. Have the restoration of the kind of authority that the Catholic bishops or hierarchy and Pope had in the 50s and 60s, without the sexual torque, as it were, to keep the.
I don't think you could have the restitution of that kind of authority, period. And I just don't think that we live in an era or a society where, as you said, there were a lot of factors, especially in American life, tending towards sort of homogenization, sort of assimilation, and a sort of a more hierarchical mentality in that era. So I don't think, sexual issues aside, I guess this is part of one of the reasons why I think of myself as a social conservative, because I think that the nightmare scenarios that liberals tend to spin, where if you give the Pope an inch, the next thing the Swiss guards are going to be knocking at your door.
You think it's all over?
We're so far from those scenarios that the thing to worry about now is sort of repairing and rebuilding the institutions to the extent we can, rather than assuming that if we take any step back towards a more institutional Christianity, next thing it's no one expects the Spanish Inquisition, right? So that's So I'm
but
skeptical
if the authority, if you believe that modernity in a way has it's like it did to the monarchy, it has done to the papacy. It's blown all those cobwebs and veils away. The mystery that Bagehot would speak of, that's very important in maintaining its power. That's sort of gone. It's certainly gone in America. It's certainly towards the cardinals and bishops. I can't think of any cardinalist country I think of as someone I think of as a holy person. Maybe I'm missing somebody more obvious.
I agree that there's been a lot of that demystification. On the other hand, again, I think we shouldn't assume that, if you go back and read medieval literature, I mean, Dante is placing popes in hell, right? There was, I think it was Michael Brendan Doherty, a blogger, had this great line about some press release from the Catholic League, right? The vigilant guardians vigilant for any whiff of anti-Catholicism. He said the Catholic League would have, fired off endless press releases attacking Dante for, putting popes in hell and sort of currying favor with the secular humanists of his day. So I don't know if that level of mystification, there was a higher level perhaps, but the sort of spirit of ribaldry and farce, and I can't believe I just used the word ribaldry. Have you ever seen that John Lovett Saturday Night Live sketch where he's talking about, anyway. Viewers can Google John Lovett and ribaldry to find out why that word is funny. But anyway, I think that's always been there, and so I think it is possible and has to be possible to have a vibrant Catholicism without the sort of papal tiara up there.
But isn't that what the Second Council really tried to do? And yet it seems to me with the current pontiff, not to get into the details with him because he's not that, from the attempt to restore authority through more beautiful liturgy, all his fancy get-up. I think that is.
But I think that's
a good thing.
I think that is how you do restore authority.
Except it just feels like someone's pulling the lever and nothing is working.
I mean, it depends. It depends where you go to mass and who you go to mass with and so on. I think that there are a lot of people, and by a lot of people I don't mean hundreds of millions of people, but I think that a more beautiful liturgy, let's say, has more power to attract people back to the Catholic Church than would the Pope just saying, let 1,000 flowers bloom again, and it's, guitar masses in every parish and so
Yeah,
on.
of course, the
But-
actual
but-
major reforms on offer now are not that. They are female priests or married priests,
Right.
Which are third-order issues for the church, I would say.
Well, I mean, it depends, for a lot of people who, came of age in the 60s and 70s, those were sort of first-order issues. And that was, the assumption was that above all, was what the church needed to do, right? That, you let priests get married, you ordain women, and then these sort of problems of people dropping out of the pews and dropping out of the seminary would take care of themselves. But, I mean, the point I tried to make in the book is that if you look at the churches and the denominations that basically did that, that turned out not to be a solution to the dilemma,
mainline
right?
Protestant.
I mean, if the sort of conventional answer for what ails Catholicism were true, then the Episcopal Church would be flush with members in every parish, and would basically be on its way to sort of overtaking Catholicism in the United States. And in fact, the Episcopal Church has declined more precipitously than the Catholic Church, and that's been true of mainline denominations in general. Which is why it's such a hard problem, sort of this, where does Christianity go from here? Because I feel like, to me, coming of age in the 90s and 2000s, it felt like the liberal answer had been tried and failed, and the more conservative answer was being tried. And at that point, I think especially in the 90s, it felt like it was being tried with some success. But that was before the sort of 1-2 punch of the Bush presidency and the Catholic sex abuse crisis sort of, I think it didn't sort of so much undo whatever progress had been made as it sort of exposed the limits of the sort of John Paul II era, the sort of Catholic Evangelical Alliance in American politics and so on, that these things had done some good, I think, some real good in sort of continuing to make Christianity more relevant in the U.S. than it had become in Europe, but they hadn't sort of figured out an answer to the deeper dilemma.
When you talk about the sort of 90s, 2000s Catholic Evangelical Alliance in America in particular, by which actually demographically one means the Catholic hierarchy and evangelicals, because actual Catholics lean very much in the opposite direction.
Let's say church-going Catholics, evangelicals, and the Catholic hierarchy.
That's not my experience of church-going Catholics.
Well, it depends.
Who seem to me, and I go to a big cathedral, so I don't go to but very easygoing, very happy in modernity, a little repelled by political messaging from the pulpit.
No, I think that's right, that there's clearly a big difference even if you just break it down to sort of conservative Catholics versus evangelicals, right? There's a difference in the level of zeal, the level of stridency, the level of political engagement, and all the rest. But it is true that if you just look at church-going Catholics, they do lean more sort of conservative on issues
but
of
as you say,
doctrine and politics.
As you concede in the book, and this is where I want to talk about a difference in our approaches, I think, you're quite candid that there is a great risk in agglomerating churches around a political party as such.
Absolutely.
In the sense that I think one of the reasons I wrote that piece in Newsweek was because I wanted to tell another generation that everywhere I went, if I ever talked on campus, the idea of Christianity was abhorrent, frightening, oppressive, ugly, intolerant.
Right.
That is
Sarah Palin kicking down the bedroom door.
That's the general feeling.
Right.
I mean, I'm not caricature. That is that's a huge thing.
And I'm aware of that feeling. Yeah.
And I think part of what this book is going to try and do, and what I was trying to do in a different way, is to present it in a fresher way and say, look, no, you've got the wrong end of the stick here.
Right.
Let's go back and look at what this religion is really about and what its values are, and you may like them. My issue, and it is in that piece, is why be political at all? My understanding of how a Christian would be political would be something like the Civil Rights Movement, which is essentially not a Democratic Party or Republican Party movement at the time, that understood itself as a moral movement, more than a political one as such. Even though what they were doing
hard to separate the moral and the political in the civil rights movement, wouldn't you say? I mean, they were a movement with a particular legal agenda,
yes,
right? That were using, in effect, a form of sort of political force, a sort of
Well,
peaceful
no.
political force
Well, but
to
the
achieve
paradox-
particular political goals, right? And
No,
the
but they
paradox,
were-
as you say, was that they were also this sort of revivalist movement, a movement that was, I mean, if you read the "I Have a Dream" speech, it's a sort of, I'm missing the right word here, but it's a speech that transcends political categories of every kind,
Yes.
right? It's a vision of the peaceable kingdom almost,
Yes, it is.
transformed.
Thy kingdom come.
Right. So that's there, but the existence of that dimension that transcended politics coexisted with a dimension that was, I mean, Martin Luther King is a
Yes,
very political
but
figure.
the force.
Right. The force comes.
Let me finish the sentence. The force came from abandoning coercion. Its greatest moments came when it was withstanding violence, which is a classic Christian move in the public sphere. It is to stand for certain principles, but not to wield power to achieve them, rather than to present oneself as a moral, as it were, voice or a moral example in the face of an injustice, and refuse to be, even if to be persecuted. I mean, there is this, and to put it in a different way, there is the strange way in which many current Christians talk about oppression of the state as if it were a bad thing for Christianity. Whereas, of course, the earliest Christians understood that as a sign that they were on the right path.
Right. But sometimes, as in the case of the Japanese Christians in the 17th century, sometimes the state does win. So it's it's perilous to just sort of
no, I know,
root
but there
for
is
one's own
but to go to the
martyrdom.
other end and talk about picking presidential candidates with a colloquium of evangelical leaders and who was going to be anointed, that, to my mind, that's what people don't like.
I completely agree that is, but I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that there is a dilemma here that can't just be resolved by saying we're going to be apolitical, right? Because, I mean, well, let's take your own case, right? Andrew Sullivan, passionate moralist, right? I mean, I've been reading your writing for decades now. Maybe not multiple. Let's say 2 decades now. I don't want to claim that I was reading your pieces on Ratzinger in 1987 from, I don't think it's a coincidence that your conscience, both moral and political, was formed by a fairly intense form of Christianity. And I think this comes through in cases where your arguments line up very clearly with traditional Christian teaching. I think it comes through in arguments where you're critiquing traditional Christian teaching on questions of gay rights and so on. I think that your sort of moral voice is inseparable, right?
It
from
is, but
and
I'm
it
not
is a
claiming
and it is a
authority
you're
on
not
those
no
grounds.
you're not claiming authority on that.
I'm claiming a witness.
Right, but that's you see that's a tricky distinction
It
to
is
make. And if
tricky.
you take the case of the civil rights movement, they abandoned a certain form of coercion, right, by committing themselves to nonviolent protest. But nonviolent protest, as Gandhi before them and recognized, is also a form of coercion. It's one of the most effective forms of coercion because it effectively forces your enemy to pass judgment on himself, right, by becoming the thing that he doesn't want to think of himself as being, the guy fire hosing 10-year-olds in the streets of Birmingham. So that element of coercion is there, and then the political element never, what is the landmark moment of the civil rights movement? It is the passage. It's not the only landmark movement, but the civil. I mean, the argument.
Was Johnston's moment,
right? But
not King's.
But the argument that was often made in the 50s and 60s by critics of the civil rights movement was that they should only be a moral voice and not seek legal change too quickly, at least, precisely because their vision was too utopian, right? Billy Graham, who in many ways I think was very impressive in his support of the civil rights movement, after King gave his I Have a Dream speech, he said something like, the lion will lie down with the lamb before, this sort of perfect vision comes to pass. So, and yet I think the civil rights protesters were right to be political. And so the challenge is,
But
I mean,
you and
imagine.
I can agree that
look,
we have to be careful
yes,
in the mixture here.
yes, and that is the. I mean, this book it's very critical. I hope you'll agree of the way religion and politics have been conflated. I think first in many ways by the religious left in the 60s and 70s, but then incredibly strongly and ultimately, I think, destructively by religious conservatives, continuing to the present day. All that I'm saying is that I feel like you want to sort of envision a refuge of sort of apoliticism, if you will, that doesn't actually exist, and that this tightrope walk. I mean, you can be apolitical completely, and God knows.
My model is entirely, in this respect, Jesus' navigation of politics, which is remarkably, rather than confronting it, steps to the side. It's rather like when they're all about to cast the stone.
But that's what
he breaks the dynamic.
But
he
that's
does
what
something
you would.
different.
But that's what you would have religious authorities do.
Yes.
That isn't what you yourself do in your own. I mean, I think you're right about. There's a distinction here, particularly in Catholic terms, I think, between the obligations of lay people involved in politics and the obligations of bishops, right? Where I agree that, but I think you and I, as lay people, I mean, I think it's silly to pretend that my political arguments are not informed, right, by my religious views about the nature of the universe.
It is quite clear, for example, that my extreme response to torture was informed overwhelmingly by my Catholic or Christian faith.
But you have said that you would.
I tried
right.
never to invoke that. Instead, taking from my faith something like a principle of human dignity, and applying it to trying to persuade others that that's the case. That's different than saying you're breaking God's will here, therefore it is wrong. I mean, that's a...
Yes, but I think that, and I agree that sort of taking a universal premise and making the argument on those grounds is the best way to make this kind of argument. I just don't think you give, I mean, if you take an issue like abortion, right? I think people on the pro-life side of the argument have spent a lot of time trying to do exactly that same thing, trying to make arguments that appeal to universal ideas about human rights and human dignity, trying to sort of have a message that could appeal to people in both political parties and so on. I guess I just feel like, as somebody who, who is pro-life and who sort of sees that movement as a compelling and important Christian cause, I think I've sort of seen the challenges, right? It's just sort of, it's a very fine line to walk. And there are moments when you have to be willing to accept that you're going to be nakedly political.
If the goal of the pro-life movement were not to make abortion illegal, but to simply persuade the majority of Americans, specifically, and in particular American women, that it is just something they should never do, would it be more successful? I mean, my concern is that the threat of criminalizing people actually immediately stops people listening.
It does, but that's why the pro-life, if you listen to, I mean, first of all, if you listen to Republican politicians, you will never hear a Republican politician say he wants to criminalize abortion in general. And if you listen to the most effective pro-life activists, and if you listen to the Catholic bishops and so on, I mean, I think the successes of the pro-life movement in moving public opinion on the issue have been driven by, yes, exactly, not using the rhetoric of criminalization, but speaking, a sort of rhetoric of moral persuasion and so on.
Nothing's been more powerful than our ability to image the little embryo, which we didn't have before.
But again, it's tricky, right? Because you can't just say, well, all debates, a debate this important is only a debate about culture and not a debate about law, right? Because culture and law interact and shape each other in all kinds of ways.
Change the culture and then the law will follow.
Right, but I mean, again, if you take
So I come from a perspective.
It's easy for you to say because you've come so far in 15 years, right? But
it works for a lot of things. If you're telling the truth, and if you're clearly, that's all your agenda is, rather than seeking power. And I think people can sniff out the distinction.
But think about the way it felt to you when Republicans, conservatives were, one, trying to enshrine the traditional definition of marriage in state constitutions, and then we're trying to put it in the U.S. Constitution, right? For pro-lifers, that already happened. Essentially, a group of justices ruled that
You are not-
pro-life conviction is, I don't want to say un-American, that's too strong a word, but that the pro-life argument is contrary to the Constitution of the United States. And that, I think, is the existence of that ruling and its consequences, both for law and culture, is what makes it's such a huge hurdle on the one hand for the pro-life movement to get over, and on the other hand, it keeps that debate political. I mean, I think for you, imagine if Republicans had succeeded in passing a constitutional amendment, sort of whatever the language was, but let's say I think it would have intended to radicalize you politically a bit more than what actually happened, which has been a sort of succession of victories for your side of the argument has done. So that's all I mean by saying, there's a real overlap between our positions on sort of this critique of how partisanship can corrupt Christianity. But it's just, I think you should have maybe a little more sympathy for how sort of Christian conservatives have wrestled with these issues, just because they're so hard.
It is very hard. And one can't take an absolutist position on either position, I think, perfectly. But then it becomes a question of what do you think you want to emphasize and nudge towards. One of the things I liked about this book a lot was its pushing away of the political and its concentration again on religion as itself. Right. So you're not going to, although I do think there's a difference, by the way, just parenthetically, because a constitutional amendment on that would have, I think, singled out a group of people within the society and had a specific part of the Constitution designed to affect them alone, whereas, and it really does affect them, not in terms of someone who doesn't want to have an abortion.
You don't think that Roe versus Wade singles out a group of, let's say, members of the species Homo sapiens and subjects them to a particular form of political treatment? That little guy in the ultrasound that you were talking about. I mean, Roe versus Wade states it writes Peter Singer's philosophy into constitutional law.
Those
right?
fetuses would not be, or embryos would, or early children in the womb would not feel anything from this. I mean, yes, they would objectively be marginalized, but they wouldn't be. You wouldn't be telling a whole bunch of active American citizens.
They would just be killed. Yeah, you wouldn't. They aren't voters, if that's what you mean. They aren't.
But I'm not going to disagree with that Roe versus Wade. I think it was a horrible decision. I think it ruined a lot of our politics in a lot of areas subsequently, and has been a bane of the culture wars. And insofar as it tempted evangelicals to come flooding into political life, I think it was the worst decision ever made by the Supreme Court. Anyway, on that, we'll come back in a second. In the book, you're very, I think, rightly tough on nationalism conflating itself with Christianity. Too much politics, co-opting Christianity. But you're also very tough on what you might call the sort of Karen Armstrong wing of modern hermeneutics of the Gospels. I mean, it's a very long, complicated topic, and I don't want to sum it, but let us say the one is at Mass and one is, or even just a prayer somewhere. Isn't it simply true that the God we are being with or attempting to be with, or in the Eucharist consuming, isn't it the case that in some ways it is, God is, Godness or whatever, it is beyond definition our understanding. So, what Pascal said was you use reason, but you have to let go of it. Right. I'm sorry, I've just completely lost my... oh yeah.
So you're saying what's wrong with
aren't they right
sort of
in saying, look, we know, I think you're great on the Gnostic Gospels because you do show why they are actually a little unconvincing and incoherent, and why in fact these
sort of boring
the Synoptic
to read.
Gospels are actually more interesting. But we know now things that we never knew before. We now know that there was a lot of fighting in the early church over what Jesus meant, who he was.
I think we knew that already.
Well,
I mean, it's in the New Testament.
Yes, but
one of the central debates of the New Testament is, well, what do we do about the Jewish law? And and obviously Paul's letters aren't being written in a vacuum. I think the debate and where I don't think we now know some amazing secret. The debate is over to what extent was there this really powerful alternative tradition that rooted in the same common experience of Jesus' life and death and resurrection that was sort of snuffed out by the sort of Orthodox party or the proto-Orthodox party in the early church. And this is the argument that is made by a host of historians and non-historians and so on, is that by combining sort of second century alternative gospels with reading between the lines of the New Testament, with the Gospel of Thomas, which some people date to the same age as at least some of the canonical Gospels, we can reconstruct this alternative narrative, which is a Jesus who was more of a sort of Zen, speaker of interesting aphorisms and so on, and who was less the Jesus of, proto-orthodoxy, orthodoxy, whatever you want to call him. And I am, again, not posturing as an academic historian and so on. This is the opinion of someone without an advanced degree and who obviously comes to this subject with strong biases, but I don't find that argument remotely convincing. I think almost all of the evidence we had suggests that that the earliest Christians were focused very intensely, were focused more intensely on Jesus' death and resurrection than they were on his sayings. And that the sort of Orthodox narrative of what Jesus' life and death meant, while obviously, was sort of, has been debated and will continue to be debated until the end of time, that narrative is the narrative that dates to the early church. So that's my, that's, again, just one man's opinion.
Of course, that's all you're doing in this book. I understand that.
But then that makes a
nonetheless,
difference. That makes a difference for the question you raised, which I think is an absolutely important question, right? Which is that sort of intellectually and philosophically, the God of the Hebrew Scriptures, the New Testament, the God of sort of Western monotheism, is a God who is, beyond the beyond, as you say, right? And so the writers like Karen Armstrong and others who say that, the most important theology is apophatic theology, right, which emphasizes what we can't know about God, is sort of that's been part of the Christian tradition throughout time and space and history. It's there in Augustine, it's there in Aquinas and all the rest, and that's hugely important. But it's also important that this beyond the beyond God, if you're a Christian, you think this beyond the beyond God decided to reveal himself to humanity in the most profound way in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, a first century sort of, troublemaking Jew. And it's that I feel like gets lost in a lot of liberal theology.
But surely what that first century Jew told people to do, the parables and riddles he told, and he did tell a lot of Zen-like parables and riddles, which seem totally counterintuitive and
absolutely
strangely. There's a reason why Merton was translating Zhuangzi. There is a sort of, and Jesus is often withdrawing to meditate. Yes. There's clearly some elements of Eastern insights into mystery that Jesus seems to embody, which brings me to the other question: is it possible that the beyond both entered human history through Jesus and in other forms, like other religions or other figures? Obviously, I think you believe that he would enter the world not incarnate, right, but through the saints, whom we can observe. But what about someone, the teachings of the Buddha? For me, I found so much of it fascinating and worthwhile, except the notion that I'm disappearing into complete nothingness, right. that there is not a God who loves me, and right. that loves me, Deus caritas est.
Right, and who loves the world, that the world itself is, beautiful. I mean, that it isn't, on the one hand, just something a sort of prison to be escaped, a sort of mediocre reality to just be transcended and so on. I mean, so the answer to your question is yes, right? That I mean, this is one of the things the Second Vatican Council was right about, right? It is, it's the Spirit bloweth where it listeth and all that, right? God, if there is a God, then every human civilization has presumably had some sort of encounter with him, and it's the idea that we can find sort of divine truths expressed through other religious figures, I think, is a tremendously important point for Christians to keep
So-
in mind.
so let me-
But then the essence of Christianity is to say, I mean, as you say in the case of the Buddha, right? Like, to be a Christian is to say that the person of Jesus of Nazareth, this sort of, fish frying, taxpayer, taxpayer too, but tax collector befriending, changing water into wine, not at the beginning of the feast, but at the end of the feast so they could keep drinking, right? That Jesus, with his sort of fleshly rebuke to people who would just say religion is about, purely escaping the body, that's you have to come back to that Jesus, right? And that Jesus, in the places where that if Christ is the incarnation of God, then he is sort of the controlling authority, if you will, for sort of settling these questions about, should we drink, should we eat, drink, and be merry sometimes, right? Yeah, sometimes we should, because he did. And this is, I think it's N.T. Wright. There was some great line where it's the sort of what's interesting about, I'm gonna butcher this, but it's something like the challenge of Jesus is that he suggests to us that in some way, and that we can't understand because God is beyond the beyond, this too is what God is really like. God is really like Jesus, right? And that's in a way incredibly comforting because it means God is someone who lays down his life for us. It's also challenging because, as we said at the beginning of this conversation, he asks the impossible of us. And it's also just really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, if that's
Well,
the most
what I
powerful
liked
moment
about
in the
the book-
Gospels
yeah, go on.
is maybe when Jesus goes to raise Lazarus from the dead, and it's the Gospel of John which really emphasizes his godhood, right? This is the most, and this is part of why I find the sort of real Jesus enthusiasts so annoying is that a lot of the points they're trying to make are already there in the Gospels, these interesting tensions. But the Gospel of John is like a very supernatural Jesus who's very in control. He knows he's going to die. He knows he's going to be resurrected. No problem. And then he goes to raise Lazarus, and he's in control. It's like Lazarus is sick. No worries. We're going to, takes a couple days. He gets there. And then he confronts the reality of Lazarus being dead and Mary and Martha weeping and everybody suffering.
Not just
and
weeping, but telling Jesus,
telling him, where
it's
were
your
you?
fault.
It's your fault, which is what we say to God every single day. And he weeps.
Yes,
And that's amazing.
he weeps.
I-
He weeps because, and why he weeps is, of course, not answered entirely in that text.
No.
But I think he weeps, well, my feeling about that story is that he weeps because these are his friends. I mean, he genuinely,
He has
genuinely feels
right.
he's let them down. Secondly, he weeps because he knows that if he takes this step, then
Right.
all,
Well, then all hell breaks
then
loose.
the
Right.
then the road to the passion kicks in, because he is invoking powers that no existing order could tolerate, because of the threat to temporal powers. But yes, what I miss in public Christianity is the telling of stories like that, where Jesus is revealed as an extraordinary, complicated, interesting character. I mean, I think I feel there are parts of the Gospels where I really hear a distinctive voice, a very clear. Often with the Mary Martha stuff, which is one of my favorite sort of themes of the Gospels.
There's the more he's among friends. I mean, you get it in a way with his relationship with Peter too, where he's sort of, Peter is his chosen one who he's always rebuking and always sort of correcting and so on.
And St. John, who somehow he's
there's-
always confiding in and taking rest with in a way. He's the one who will always understand, somehow be beloved in some special way. And he is all about, and you were very kind to mention my own book, his fundamental relationship, Jesus on earth, his friendship.
Right.
Greater man hath no love than this, and he laid down his life for his friends. I just found, just personally, that one of the things that we can do better is read about the saints. Actually, I mean, because I think when you actually instead of not necessarily hagiographies or the sort of but the actual lives that these people lived and the sacrifices they made and the convictions they had, and yet we're not. But anyway, can I call it your party, the Republican Party? You're not that identified as a Republican as such, are you? Or are you?
There are two political parties in America. I'm a conservative and feel a stronger identification with the Republican Party. So we can say that.
Do you think that if Mitt Romney is the nominee, that you would be supporting a Christian?
Well, that's why the subtitle of the book is How We Became a Nation of Heretics. Heretic is obviously a very loaded word, but I use it because I think it is the correct word to describe a lot of American religion today. That we are a country that, on the one hand, is no longer traditionally Christian, and sort of the bastions of traditional Christianity are weaker than they've ever been. But on the other hand, I don't think we're not a secular country, clearly, and I don't think we're a sort of we're not a post-Christian country, because most of American religion is still more influenced by Christianity than by any other tradition. I mean, for all of the interest in Buddhism and Hinduism and Jewish mysticism and so on, the controlling theological influence on American life is Christianity by a factor of like 20 or something, even now. And so what is American religion? Well, it's Christian-ish. It's sort of fascinated by Jesus, but constantly reinterpreting and rewriting his story. It's I think it's we're a nation of heretics, and I think that is the correct word. And I think we're heretics to one another. I don't think I'm not writing this book and saying I am saying there is a core of historic Christian faith, and much of American religion diverges from it, both on sort of core doctrinal issues, but also on sort of the money and sort of sex and some of these issues we touched on earlier. But I'm also saying that we've sort of all drifted in all these different directions, so that from one person's vantage point, the other looks like a heretic, and vice versa. And in the case of Romney and Mormonism, we've had this whole debate. The evangelicals in particular are focused on this. Is Mormonism Christianity, right? Well, look, traditional Christians believe in a certain set of sacred scriptures and a certain set of doctrines. Mormonism adds some sacred scriptures and amends some of those doctrines, particularly related to the nature of Christ and the Trinity. If Mormonism had popped into existence in the 4th century A.D., we would remember it as the way we remember Arianism and a lot of the heresies of that time. So I don't think it's problematic to call it a heresy now, and it sort of solves the is it Christian, is it not issue, which is sort of a silly debate. Yes, Mormons are Christians in the sense that they claim to be followers of Jesus Christ, and are in a very intense way followers of Jesus Christ. But from the Mormon point of view, you and I are heretics. And from, I think, my own, and I'm not going to speak for you, but maybe from your point of view as well, the Mormons are heretics, and it's okay to sort of say that. I don't think we need to.
Are you a heretic?
I try not to be. I try not to be.
Yeah.
No, I mean, no.
I think one of the dangers you have in writing a book like this.
Right, is I'm pointing the finger and saying heretic,
yes,
right? And I am to some extent doing that. I do think that,
But not from a position of authority. You can't
No.
do anything with these people except expose that what they believe has nothing whatsoever to do with what Jesus taught. But that's
no,
a ballsy move. I just fear that once everybody's a heretic and authority is essentially lost, how do we live as Christians now? How do we sustain this life? And surely there must be within anybody's religious faith those periods when one is going to Mass and nothing seems to be gelling or working. There are periods when there are certain doctrines you just have difficulty understanding. There are doctrines, when we say the Nicene Creed, that we've forgotten what they actually mean, these words, because they've become so familiar, consubstantial with the Father. In some ways, just forcing us into a new word makes us look at this again. And one of the things that I've tried to do in my adult life is constantly look at the religion that created me in many ways, and keep trying to look at it in different ways so it doesn't get ossified or calcified into something that isn't real to me anymore. It's
and this is what the Karen Armstrongs are right, that fundamentally practice is more important than dogma to mean, to almost any religion, but to Christianity and
can't
and
think
Jesus
yourself-
himself. You cannot read the New Testament. The parable of, he says many will say Lord, Lord, and and not mean it or whatever. And the parable of the sheep and the goats, where what matters is who helped the poor, not. I mean, that's clearly there. I think from my perspective, the problem with much of contemporary religion is that there's an assumption that if the practice is more important than the dogma, then you just jettison the dogma because it's controversial and divisive and nobody understands it and so on. But then the next thing you know, you get rid of the dogma and suddenly people aren't practicing anymore because there has to be a reason. There has to be a reason for the practice,
Of course,
right?
exactly. I mean, there's no question. Although Jesus is
If it's
quite
just
clear that religion is what you do. If you can say whatever you like about what you believe, but what your religion actually is what you do. Now, obviously, I agree with you.
But
you
this is
can't
where,
have
but
the
this is where,
horizontal
and
without
this
the
is
vertical.
where the sort of, I mean, I'm just stealing it from G.K. Chesterton, but the idea that paradox is central to Christian dogma. I mean, if you look at sort of, the endless debates over, free will versus grace in terms of salvation. I mean, and then you sort of try and map that onto your own life. Well, sometimes virtue feels like free will and it feels like exertion, and sometimes it's clear that you're hopelessly corrupted by sin and only an infusion of grace can help you. But holding those ideas in tension and not just saying, well, we're going to rationalize it. It's all free will. I mean, that was what Pelagius did, right? And it made sense. It was like, why would God give us commandments we can't follow? Let's just rationalize it. You can follow these commandments, just follow them. But that's not what human life is like.
No, and
it's that. I just feel like it's the same thing with sort of the broader dogma and practice issue. It's like, you can say, oh, the Eucharist. It's we don't need to worry about transubstantiation versus consubstantiation. It's just a lovely symbol of, of Jesus. But then, if it's just a symbol, Flannery O'Connor.
Sorry, it was one of
other interviewer
one of the best
will step
scripts.
on me.
One,
Right.
one
If
of the
it's
best
just
scripts at a dinner party ever.
Right. If it's just a symbol, I say to hell with it. But that's right. I mean, that's
Look, I was in high school figuring out transubstantiation because it's what separated me from all these other people.
right. All the prots.
All the
right?
prots, yeah. But even now,
That was in no way meant to cast aspersions
No.
on the Protestant book buying public.
no, we're describing tribes
Right.
in a particular form, and I was very much a minority tribe. I've made a lifetime out of being a minority tribe somewhere within some community. Now, where was I going with that? Is it not possible for people to understand that paradox, to understand that their faith will sometimes be doubt, or their faith may sometimes be transcendence? They're not entirely sure, like transubstantiation, what really that means. Like when I take that on my tongue, I drink that wine. It tastes like a wafer and tastes like wine. Right. But we're being asked to believe that it is the body and soul, body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus. I'm just fascinated by the mechanics of faith at that moment.
But
But obviously, we have to some extent surrender ourselves to something that is completely mysterious, that we just have to say, in some way, we cannot understand. This is Jesus' way of staying with us.
and some of those are.
But to a non-believer, that sounds completely pathetic. It just as you insisting upon paradox, and I insist on mystery.
Right.
Hitch, God rest his soul, would be all over us, right? He'd be all over. What's his bloody mystery?
He would be until you asked him to, justify his fierce moralism in a sort of meaningless universe where we're all just fizzing soda bottles. I mean, there are intellectual difficulties with Christianity, but there are other systems of belief have intellectual difficulties.
But that gives
well.
us hope, doesn't it? I mean, I want.
Well, and it's
end on
also this idea of, I think, what a lot of non-believers and skeptics don't understand when they look at religious belief is they look at the most outrageous thing, right? Transubstantiation for Catholics, that's one of the most outrageous things that the Catholic Church asks you to believe. But I think with religious belief, it's as in any relationship, anything, the relationship is what is primary, and then because you have trust in the relationship, and maybe it's trust in your relationship with Jesus Christ himself, or it's trust in your relationship with your church, which obviously many Catholics don't have these days, and so on. But out of that trust, you don't start with transubstantiation, I guess is what I'm saying.
Right.
You start with the story of Jesus, and whether this story is compelling, and whether you feel called to believe in that story, and then from that story you hit the moment when Jesus says, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood, and most of the crowd leaves, right? But the disciples stay because they feel that they have reason to trust even when they don't quite understand, and that is sort of the ultimate nature of faith. But I think it's wrong to say that it's all, it's not that it's all unreasonable. You have reasons to feel trust in Jesus that enable you to stay with him when you reach a point where you don't understand,
It's rather
completely
like
what
a
he's
marriage in which there can be pretty bad days or big fights or good periods and bad periods, but you remember that you're still married, and that in fact that's your primary commitment. I mean, when people ask me to leave, why I don't just leave the church over matters such as gay rights or something, to me it just trivializes the church. I mean, I don't mean to deny there isn't an argument here, but I do not think it's an argument worth leaving. If I'm prepared, if the Gospels have moved me in my life the way they have, if the sacraments have changed my life the way they have, that issue is not something I could possibly leave my home over.
I mean, I think the question with issues like that is to what extent, if your disagreement with the church over homosexuality leads you to stop listening to the church in general, then I think there is a strong argument for leaving the church. But I think the question, the ultimate issue is, it's not sort of, from my point of view, the essence of sort of small o orthodox faith is not just sort of mindless assent to whatever letter has been co-signed by 2 Vatican sub-prelates today, right? It's just the idea that in your Christian life you have authorities outside of yourself. And it doesn't mean you ignore your own conscience,
right?
And it doesn't mean that you aren't willing to sort of think critically about those authorities. But I feel that absent the idea of a non-personal authority, that religion just sort of, and Christianity in particular, just sort of, it drifts into narcissism and solipsism and
again,
all of these things that are characteristic of our lives as we live them today.
But that's the tension, isn't it? Because the authority taken out of proportion is dangerous. I mean, I think that a lot of us felt that the authoritarian structure of the church, as well as the nature of the priesthood after Vatican II, was definitely part of the ghastliness that happened with child rape and youth abuse.
Yep.
You need both. But it does seem to me that a lot of American Catholics are figuring it out. I mean, they are showing up. American Catholic attendance is pretty stable now, isn't it? Or not?
As far as I can tell, the challenge for the church is that a lot of the stability is created by Hispanic immigration.
Yeah.
And if you just look at white Catholics, there's a steep decline in the crisis years, but then it's just sort of, yeah, I mean...
Well, then you look at a place like Ireland, where my religion...
Right, in Western Europe.
It's wiped. It's just never has a religion collapsed so quickly as it just did in Ireland. You write in this book about a physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. What do you mean by that? Because the stories that we have...
What do I mean by that? Yeah.
Yeah. Because
I mean a flesh and blood resurrection that did not take place just as a sort of either a psychological experience purely in the minds of the disciples, or as something they experienced solely in a transported religious state, right? So it was something that could have been experienced by you and I in our current caffeinated but not sort of transported experience.
But what happens when he vanishes?
I don't know what happens when he. I mean, the
Well, someone who's a physical body can't vanish, can he?
Well,
Into
a
thin air.
physical,
Yeah, we're
someone
told he
who's
does.
someone who, I mean, the interesting thing, and I think one of the, to me, persuasive things about the New Testament is that there isn't an attempt to fit the resurrection experiences into expected categories.
No,
he doesn't behave like a completely resurrected, normal, back from the grave. I'm fine.
What's
I
for
mean, he's not like
breakfast?
right. What's for? Well, he does say. Well, I mean, he does. You know, eat. He does eat with them, but he doesn't. He's not. One, he's not Lazarus back from the dead, right? He's not just restored to his normal life. Two, he's not resurrected, sort of, and then he goes and he's Neo in the Matrix, and he suddenly goes and kills the high priests and slaps everybody around with his new superpowers. And he's not a ghost. They're very focused on that. He has physical hands and wounds in his hands, and he eats and so on. But he does things that. He disappears. Sometimes they don't recognize him, and then they do recognize him. So it's clearly a very mysterious thing. But I do think the stress on I think the stress on the physicality of it is very important, because it makes the point that this is a religious experience unlike any other. Religious experience is a human universal, not in the sense that all people have it, but in the sense that it seems to be available to people in all cultures at all times and places. But it is usually something that takes place through a sort of transport to a heightened sense of reality. These sort of mystical experiences where you sort of feel yourself in tune with the universe and so on.
Some of the post-resurrection stories are a little like that.
They have a little of that, like when he's with the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and he's sort of interpreting the scriptures for them, and their hearts are opened and so on.
How could they not recognize him? I mean, and they recognize him in the breaking of the bread. So you understand this story is all about the Eucharist.
Because it's a story. I mean, because it is our. I mean, hopefully it is our sort of ultimate destiny, which we can't quite comprehend at this moment, breaking into a fallen and compromised world. And so it's there, he's there with them, and yet there's also some distance. But I think to me, one of the interesting things about contemporary religion is the extent to which we live in this sort of disenchanted age, right, where people, especially educated people, feel very uncomfortable believing in sort of literal miracles, right? Whether it's sort of medieval-seeming stuff like levitating statues and saints and so on, or it's healings and so forth. But religious belief is still present, and what's happened is that, fewer people believe in a bodily resurrection, right? This sort of a core dogma of Christianity, but more people believe in heaven as a sort of disembodied state. And in a way, right, that sort of seems intuitive. It's like, all right, we've gotten rid of the sort of weird, wicky-wacky, magical stuff, and we believe in a kind of spiritual resurrection that doesn't seem so crazy and supernatural. Except that, isn't a spiritual resurrection much weirder? Wouldn't it be very strange if, having lived our lives as bodily creatures, we, spent eternity without bodies? What would, to me, in a weird way, the idea of a bodily resurrection and Jesus Christ being bodily resurrected and so on is actually, it's more compelling precisely because it suggests a continuity with our lived experience. So rather than this sort of like, we're on clouds with harps and we're floating around.
It's incredibly boring.
And it's incredibly boring and so on. And, no, there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. And, so in a way, to me, it seems more supernatural to people than a sort of purely spiritual experience. But I think it's actually less supernatural. And it's more what you would expect from the God who, made us the way we are, if he made us at all, with beards and and collared shirts and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I'm reminded of when I asked Michael Oakeshott what he thought about salvation, and he said, "Who would ever want to be saved?"
Right,
which is actually a Christian truth, which is we don't want to erase our personalities, our spirit,
right.
And that's why we pray to the dead. As people, I mean, I ask my grandmother for intercession all the time because she's way holier than I will ever be.
But it's that middle ground between we don't want our bodies and our sort of ourselves as they are annihilated completely, but neither do we want to just sort of, you wouldn't want to spend eternity as the person you are now, because there has to be some sort of change.
That's
right?
for
That's
sure.
for damn sure. There has to literally for damn sure. I mean, that is in a sense what hell might be.
Yes,
right?
no,
It
I
is
know.
eternity as the person
Yeah.
you are right now. And so this is again why the resurrection narratives are interesting, because they suggest there's a continuity. He's still got the wounds. His life was real, right? He didn't just come down to heaven from heaven as a miraculous super guy who wasn't really touched. No, the nails went in, and the wounds presumably will be, whatever it means for them to be there for all eternity, they'll be there. But so it's changed and yet not changed, and that is, again, part of what I find hopeful.
Transfigured,
And
maybe,
right,
Figured
transfigured.
is probably the
yes.
proper term.
Yes.
It's funny, during one of the most intense periods of my life, one of my best friends appeared to me in a dream, who had just died, absolutely identifiable as him, but not quite him. Transfigured into something slightly different and haunting, but joyful, immensely joyful. It was a very pleasant dream to see him again, and not see him, like a dream.
Right.
I mean, that's the best I can do with understanding Emmaus.
Right. It's in that, it's trying to contain two realities at once.
Yes, which is a much more interesting idea than people acknowledge. Christianity is actually extraordinarily.
No, and I do think in the book that I've written, I think you've just. It sounds sort of defensive and half-hearted in a way, but I'm writing hopefully for an audience that often has very strongly anti-Christian feelings.
Yes,
I
which
hope
is
some
important.
members of that audience will read the book, and so that is part of the message of the book.
Yeah.
Christianity, a more interesting idea than you might think.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
We're
Andrew.
done.
This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, you probably won't get many of those questions in future. Maybe you will. I don't know.
No, this was the best. This is why I was so
I was happy
eager
to
and,
do
gra-
too.
and
Well, I'm
grateful
great.
to have you do this.
I'm grateful for the book. I'm genuinely grateful as a human being.